All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for this webinar. My name's Laura Katawaki, and I'm going to be the moderator for the webinar today. We're really excited to be able to present to you a webinar focused on SFU's Housing Solutions Lab, which has been exploring housing options for older adults. As some of you might know, our Provincial Seniors Housing Working Group released a report on housing affordability and how that's impacting seniors last year. And so we're really keen in this year to look at different solutions and innovations in the housing field. So we're very happy to be able to have our partners from SFU here to talk about some of the work that they've been doing with communities on the North Shore. Before we begin the webinar, I'd like to acknowledge the homelands of the Indigenous peoples of this place we now call Canada and honor the many territorial keepers of the lands on which we work. I personally today am working on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Coquitlam First Nation and would like to thank the Coquitlam who continue to live on these lands and care for them, along with the waters and all that's above and below. And as our topic is housing today, I thought as a part of my journey to learn more about the First Nations territory that I live on, I looked into the housing work that is being done by the Coquitlam First Nation. And so just wanted to highlight a special achievement that they've recently had. As in January 2024, they actually opened their first affordable housing development, which has 14 homes for members of their nation. And this is really historic, actually, as there was the land code, which was passed in 2020, and that actually transferred back to the Coquitlam First Nation management of the reserve lands, which had been held by the government of Canada since 1876. And so that was what allowed them to take this role in actively developing the housing for their First Nations. So I thought that was a really interesting piece of history to learn about, and the fact that up until 2020, they hadn't really had that opportunity to develop housing due to the land code. A few housekeeping items before we begin the webinar. So during the presentations, everyone will be muted, but feel free to introduce yourself in the chat box if you like, and you can mention your organization and also the territory that you're residing on if you know the First Nations territory. There'll be a brief question period at the end for any questions from the presentation, but we'll also have the Q&A feature open as well, so you can put questions in there. And as you hopefully noticed, the webinar is being recorded currently, and it's going to be posted on Healthy Aging Core. And after the webinar, we'll make the slides available and also send up some follow-up information. So we have two presenters here who are from SFU Renewable Cities. And so our first presenter is Leanne Sawatsky, and she's the Interim Executive Director of Renewable Cities, which is a special initiative of Simon Fraser University's Morris J. Wask Center for Dialogue. And she leads the strategic direction for Renewable Cities with a focus on supporting smart growth for compact, complete, livable, and resilient communities through innovation in housing and transportation. Her expertise and leadership is characterized by a commitment to systems thinking, dialogue, and collaboration for robust and durable solutions. And our second presenter today is Rebecca Parker, and she's the project manager at Renewable Cities. Her recent work focused on coordinating the Housing Solutions Lab, which we'll be hearing about today. And she engaged stakeholders from the community and government to identify hidden housing solutions for seniors. And Rebecca brings an interdisciplinary lens to her work with extensive experience in facilitation, knowledge mobilization, and program coordination. So without further ado, then I'll hand it over to Rebecca and Leanne for their presentation.
Thanks so much, Laura, for the introduction. I'm joining this conversation from the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And I just want to acknowledge with gratitude how they've been stewarding the land that we're on since time immemorial. So we're really excited to work and to share our work with you today on the Housing Solutions Lab. We've been doing this in partnership with Hollyburn Community Services Society. We're going to go through our presentation. If you have any questions as you go along, then feel free to add them to the Q&A function or write them in the chat, and then we'll have some time for this at the end. So before we dive in to our presentation, we'd love to get a sense of some of your experience. There should be a little poll that's going to come up on your screen. And the question is, in your lifetime, have you lived with people outside of your family or significant other? So a significant other could be a partner or a spouse. We're asking this question kind of at a high level. There's not a specific time frame or requirement, and it's really about your own definition of what living with someone looks like. That could be roommates, home sharing, or some other situation. We just want to get a sense of who of us have lived with people outside of our families. We'll just let everyone respond to the poll, and it's just meant to be a quick one. So the yes or no is fairly quick to respond to. You could also add in the chat while we're waiting for the poll to close and for everyone to finish their responses. In 2 or 3 words, what was that like for you? What is it like to be sharing your home and living with somebody, not necessarily sharing your home, but living with somebody outside of your family? What words come to mind when you think of that experience? I'll just take a look over at the chat here. Someone says awkward. Okay, oh, I have the poll responses here. So 79% of folks have lived with people outside of their family and 21% have not. So some of us have experience with sharing our spaces in our homes with others and that are outside of our family or partners, and some of us may not. Sharing homes is really a personal act and it has a lot of complexities. And this is certainly something that we heard while we were working on this lab. So I have a few other comments I see. I see community, I see best not to, enjoyable, people feeling connected, supporting, challenges due to lifestyle, different lifestyles, positive experience, both amazing and difficult. Yeah, glad it was temporary. Lots and lots of feelings and experiences, obviously, because like I said, it's a very personal act. It's very complex. So I'm going to just pop over to the next slide here.
And if I can just interrupt for a second, Leanne and Rebecca, we just had a comment that if you could speak up a little bit, because a couple people are having troubles hearing you.
Oh, okay. Yeah, and I do have my headphones in, so I could take those off if needed, and I will try to speak up. Sorry about that.
Thank you.
Yeah, so for our agenda today, our plan for this session is to give you a bit of an overview of our context and the focus of our Housing Solutions Lab. We did some look during our lab, and we'll share with you sort of the results of the lab and where we're going next with it. So some of the things we looked at during the lab were some costs and benefits of different types of housing solutions that we explored. We're going to share with you what we were hearing from different engagement sessions that we had with participants. We're going to share with you a little bit about a basic pilot program design that came out of the lab and considerations that service providers might want to take into account as they are considering about how they might want to implement something. And then we're also going to talk about possible extensions and the path forward looking ahead. So why were we doing the Housing Solutions Lab in the first place? What was our main area of focus and the impetus for this? One of our observations is that our housing stock in Canada is the majority is single detached houses. So 53% of Canadian housing is single detached homes. And a majority of these, 55%, are occupied by 1- and 2-person households. And these are often older adults. We have an aging population that's living in single detached houses. And so this is one of the reasons why we chose this to be one of our focus, or to be our focus area for the Housing Solutions Lab. And as we saw in a recent Globe and Mail article that was actually based on a CMHC report that was released in November 2023, people are staying in their houses for longer. The average age of selling single detached homes is now increased to over 85 years old. There's a few reasons for this. There's the high cost of living for moving. There's a lack of downsizing options. Perhaps or often we see that there's not a lot of diversity in the housing supply. So what people are looking for is just not available. And we also have a healthier aging population, which is great. And they have a desire to stay in their neighborhood and they want to stay in their community and to continue to live independently. Those are two sort of key highlighting or reasons that we're highlighting. We know that there's also many others, so you can also feel free to add those into the chat. The result of all of these trends is that as people are aging and you have one or two persons living in a single detached house, there's people that are not necessarily using their full homes. They might only be using a portion of it. So some bedrooms may not be used, and some parts of the house, perhaps as you're aging, those that need to be accessed by stairs, those are also being unused. So through funding from CMHC and Vancity, we focus on housing solutions for older adults who are living in single detached homes, either by themselves or with one other person. And our goal of the lab is really to explore different housing options and to focus on designing a pilot program that matches older adult homeowners with potential renters. We know that this is not a silver bullet for the housing crisis, and there's a lot of deeper root causes and other solutions that are also needed, but this we're considering as one potential piece of the puzzle that could offer some solutions for some communities. So what are some of the solutions that we were exploring during the lab? Some of the solutions we're looking at is home sharing. This is where a home seeker has a private room, they share a kitchen, potentially they share a bathroom with a home provider. There's secondary suites. This means there's a separate unit. This might be a basement suite or a garden suite that's attached to the house, or coach houses, also known as laneway houses. These are separate units from the primary house. Coach houses and secondary suites can also be called accessory dwelling units or ADUs. Now, since many of you are joining us from across BC, we wanted to give a little bit of context about accessory dwelling units in BC. Two of the three solutions that we are considering are considered to be accessory dwelling units. We're in a time where we have this changing provincial context, that some of the housing legislation and programming is changing. Up until now, generally, each local government has regulated its own accessory dwelling unit policies. And until the new legislation comes in, then that's the continued context. There are some proposed provincial legislation. One will permit secondary suites or one laneway home in all communities in BC. So this is Bill 44 that's in its third reading. The other thing about accessory dwelling units is thinking about where are we finding that accessory dwelling units are more common across BC. They're most common in large cities in BC, but they're also present in smaller communities, particularly where we're seeing residents that are paying a high portion of their income towards housing. Or where single detached homes have a high value, and also where there's tourism or amenities or attractions. So if we're thinking places like Tofino or Sun Peaks, and mid-sized communities as well, they also have a high uptake of accessory dwelling units. So communities like Nelson or Esquimalt, Squamish, or White Rock. So our solutions lab was focused on addressing many interconnected crises. We are seeking to use a systems approach and a multi-solving lens as we're exploring how these housing solutions might address challenges like climate, potentially by lowering emissions that are associated with buildings, by adding units to existing homes, addressing social isolation by offering more opportunities for older adults to interact with others, affordability by offering a supplemental income for older adults, potentially at affordable rental rates for tenants, depending on what the specific agreement is, and also addressing community resilience and connectedness. More connected neighborhoods are a really important part of addressing climate resilience. So if we think about extreme heat events, for example, it's a really important piece for individuals' health, but also for generally, social connectedness can also benefit community health. I'm going to pass it over to Rebecca. Rebecca's going to give us a little bit of an overview about the process.
Thanks, Leanne. So what did we actually do for the Housing Solutions Lab? For this lab, we really focused on Vancouver's North Shore because that's where Hollyburn Community Services Society is located. And there's also a match of demographics. It has a lot of single detached homes where there's an older population. And this was set up as a solutions lab, meaning that we were focused on testing and iterating an idea. So to do this, we did some desk research and analysis on the local context. We held multiple rounds of engagement workshops with older adults, service providers, municipal staff, iterating on the program design each time we had a workshop. As well, we also completed a cost-benefit analysis comparing the different solutions and also their carbon costs and savings. And through this, we worked with Hollyburn to work on the design of a pilot program for matchmaking homeowners with potential home seekers or renters. The funding for this project didn't go into funding a pilot, but it's getting everything ready up until the point of operating a pilot. And so we're in the final stage, we're wrapping up now. So by the end of March, we're going to be launching an archive site that describes all the solutions, their barriers, what we found out and what we heard, as well as some of our reports and pilot program materials that will be available. So knowing this, let's dive into some of the analysis first. And we're going to take a look from an environmental lens, a social lens, and an economic lens, comparing these three housing solutions. So first off, we have the carbon emissions that are associated with buildings. Now, there's two types here. There's embodied carbon, which comes from the materials used to build a structure. And then there's also operating carbon emissions, which are the emissions released when we're operating or using a space. So this could be through heating, for example. To give a sense of carbon emissions without just giving a number, we're going to compare the emissions to how much carbon would be released if we drove a Toyota Corolla from Vancouver's North Shore all the way down to Los Angeles in California and back. So comparing that, if we look at the embodied carbon, a new home average 2,000 square feet would be about the equivalent of 45 to 54 round trips. Now, then that's for just the construction materials, the materials needed in the construction of this space. Now, home sharing requires 0 trips because nothing needs to be built. There's not a new addition being added, there's no renovations being done, so it has a 0 embodied carbon emissions there. Comparing that to secondary suites, we know secondary suites can either be very ready to use depending on the state of the building or require major renovations. So that's why we have the 2 different numbers there, the 1 to 4 trips for minor renovations and 4 to 8 trips for major renovations. Now, coach houses, you're building a completely new structure, so it requires more carbon emissions, so 14 to 18 trips on that front. Now, if we shift over to operating carbon, this really depends on how a home is heated. If a home is heated through electricity, like through a heat pump or gas or other means, but we standardize this and use this as an assumption in our analysis. For a rough estimate, we said the operating carbon emissions of home sharing would be 1 to 2 trips per year, compared to 2 or 3 trips per year for a coach house. Now, an average 2,000 square foot home would be roughly equivalent to 8 to 10 round trips. So as you can see, some of these solutions have a much lower carbon impact than building a new housing unit specifically. So let's take a look at some of the social benefits. Now, the social benefits here, if we look at what Canada HomeShare has found in their program, a lot of their older adult participants reported being more socially connected. Now, this is not just from having another person around to interact with, but they actually found that a little bit of extra cash and income for the older adults meant that they could spend a little bit more on dinner with friends or other going to activities with them. And so it increased the amount of social experiences and times they were having. Another social benefit is that for some, just having an extra person around adds a sense of security. For example, in the case of a fall or extreme weather, they like having the sense of having someone around who could check in on them if needed. And also, there is an opportunity for programs to pair, for example, students with older adults. And an agreement could be made here where if the students contributes to helping with chores for a little bit each week, it could be doing some yard work or maintenance in some way, they could negotiate a lower rent. So there's a benefit for the student to have a lower rent, and the older homeowner gets support with maintenance around the house. And finally, there's also a benefit of a sense of social responsibility and supporting the community by saying, hey, I have space. I know people need homes. This is where they could go. Now, there are also some challenges with considering sharing a home or creating a secondary suite. We know that there's lower privacy, especially with home sharing. There's not as much autonomy in the space necessarily, and you have to get used to sharing a kitchen with someone else, for example. There's also the noise factor and having someone else's lifestyle integrated or around some of yours. And I heard some of those reflections in our initial question as well. You know, getting used to having someone else come through the kitchen and cooking and making those, making a bit of noise, which is normal for living a life. And so there's a little bit of less control of your over a space if you're sharing a kitchen or a bathroom and things like that. So before someone would want to consider home sharing or building a secondary suite, there's a chance for reflection to say, okay, you know, how much space is available in my home and how much privacy do I feel is that I need to work with my life, and how do I feel about general noise and just the smells of someone else cooking and sharing a kitchen. And finally, let's take a look at some of the financial pieces of this solution. Now, I'm going to go through these numbers pretty quickly. This will be available on our archive site. And I will say that these are estimates for reference only. Every project has its own unique context, and these numbers were based on a North Shore of Vancouver context and might not translate across jurisdictions. So this is really for reference. So if I look at these at a high level, I just want to highlight that home sharing is really the cheapest option. It takes the least amount of time to set up and has lower maintenance cost. There's no extra property taxes, and you know, it's quite easy to implement. The trade-off there is that there's much less privacy for both the home provider and for the home seeker. If you look at secondary suites, they can be easy or complex depending on the house itself. Some older homes are really difficult to bring up to building code requirements, and this might require extreme renovations involving electrical and plumbing, depending on the situation. And it can be quite complicated and expensive, depending on the situation. Or someone might have a secondary suite that's ready to go, and that might not need as much investment. Secondary suites offer more privacy than home sharing because of the separation between units. And finally, coach houses are the most expensive to build, but they can offer it a lot more sense of separation and privacy. There are property taxes that come up here, insurance costs, higher loans if that financing isn't available. And on average, when we were talking to builders, they're saying usually it costs at least $500,000 to build a coach house within the Metro Vancouver context. And even though that number is very high, if someone's living in the urban center, it might be cheaper than a condo, for example. So there's some considerations there. Now, the amount of ongoing costs really depends on how high of a loan a homeowner would need to implement these. Our numbers here assume there's no external financial support, and it doesn't include utilities because there's a lot of variance that happens there depending on the building. So despite this, the extra rental income that a homeowner could receive might be very beneficial, especially if they are on a fixed income. So again, we'll be releasing more details about this on our archive site, and we'll be happy to share a bit more details about the assumptions and the breakdown of the different costs there. And I'll pass it back to Leanne.
Thanks, Rebecca. So now we've heard the specifics of each type of solution. We want to get into sharing with you what people thought of these potential solutions. So many folks were expressing concerns about privacy. I saw that reflected in the chat as well, this challenge of sharing a space. People are wanting private spaces. For many older adults, then home sharing is not an option because of the amount of shared space that is required. Some folks were expressing that they would only consider these options for family members, not for strangers. There's a lot of anxiety that people are feeling around living with someone they do not know. Safety was also one of the biggest concerns. Privacy and safety just came up very consistently as the top concerns. People are wanting to know, how is a pilot program going to ensure my safety, and how is it going to deal with worst case scenarios? And there's also a sense of uncertainty about change. Many homeowners are feeling uncertain about the unknowns of living with someone new. Others are feeling resistant to lifestyle changes that might be needed if they're home sharing. So we also looked at potential solutions, and a lot of the lab was about co-designing and co-developing potential solutions. Some of the solutions included potentially how matchmaking between home seekers and home providers through a program that's run by a trusted organization could help address some of these concerns. It also included solutions of explicit emergency options and contingency plans in place. Another option is including multiple meetings between home seekers and home sharers to ensure there's a good fit between potential matches before actually entering into an agreement in a living situation. And again, with the support of a matchmaking organization. And then the last idea that a lot of homeowners were quite enthused about was a trial period. Now, we put a big asterisk beside this because they're very popular among home providers for this added sense of security and sort of de-risking this new, this new way of living. But for home seekers, it really was not feeling like an equitable option. Most folks are not interested in moving somewhere if there's a risk that they will also need to move out within a few months. It's just not realistic for the amount of stability and security that we need for our homes. Another area of concern was around legal uncertainties. So homeowners are finding the idea of being, the homeowners that were joining our workshops were finding the idea of being a landlord intimidating. These potential participants also want to ensure that there's a legal agreement that's in place. Particularly, home sharing isn't covered by the BC Residential Tenancy Act, so there's some gray areas that need to be addressed. There's also questions that were raised around liability. For example, who would be at fault if something happens in the home? Some of the solutions that were developed with the participants were vetting participants through the matchmaking program, educating home providers and home seekers, for example, on different respective responsibilities or insurance options, and then there being an option for the matchmaking program itself to administer the legal agreement for the housing arrangement. The next area of concern we categorized under financial feasibility. So all participants are reporting feeling financial stress about the high cost of living. For older adults on fixed income, they're really feeling a lack of affordable downsizing option. For home providers, they wanted to make sure that any option they're considering makes financial sense. So if they want to undertake renovations or create a coach house, it does need to make financial sense for them. Secondary suites and coach houses were certainly the most popular in theory because of that higher privacy that Rebecca was speaking about, but the costs and the long implementation timelines for construction or renovations start to make them feel really unrealistic. Some of the participants said that they'd be willing to make those investments for family, but for someone that they don't know, it felt too unknown or uncertain, so they weren't feeling comfortable with that. Some of the possible solutions that we explored were having the government support forgivable loans or provide tax deferrals or exemptions, ensuring that the rental income or the rental rates cover costs, so the costs for the homeowners, and then adding to ensure that there's a little extra income supplement. And then another option is about tax deductions on rental income. So for some of these solutions, we'd really need to have government support in place to ensure that they can make sense and actually be implemented. I'm going to pass it back to Rebecca to speak a little bit about reasons for joining the Matchmaker program.
Thanks, Leanne. So despite all these challenges that you just heard, not a lot of participants were actually interested in these solutions, as long as they were backed by a matchmaking program provided by a trusted third party. So why would someone say yes? Allowing tenure, letting people stay in their home longer was really important. Also, the social connection piece that I spoke about a little bit earlier, creating more vibrancy in their network. One participant really wanted a Golden Girls situation where they imagined friendships arising from it. And that's not necessarily the expectation, but there's potential for that. As I also mentioned, people were really excited about helping other people, a sense of altruism and supporting folks in their community. getting practical help either through this tricky process of figuring out how to make a legal secondary suite or coach house was very exciting for people, or just the practical help of getting support with chores around the house was really appealing to people. And finally, quality of life was also an important piece. People could stay in their home for longer and stay in their neighborhoods where they already have their connections. And there was also a potential for more connected communities as well. So these housing solutions really don't happen in isolation. We've heard a lot of challenges with local governments from those who are participants who were hoping to create a secondary suite or a coach house. And throughout these slides, if you see the italic quotes at the bottom, these are actual quotes from our engagement sessions. So what were some of the biggest challenges? First, people were very frustrated and confused by permit approval processes. They felt convoluted, they didn't know eligibility pieces. It was really difficult to navigate. As well, there were some really restrictive zoning bylaws that didn't allow people to pursue the solution they were looking for. And finally, there's a high cost of aligning with building codes, as I mentioned earlier, specifically with secondary suites. Someone might have a house from the 1950s where the electrical panel is downstairs and, in the basement, and getting that ready would require a big change and a lot of investment to make that happen. So what are some possible solutions to these challenges? First, getting a more streamlined approvals process from the municipality or local government, and ideally with an easy to use and easy to understand guide for implementation. How do you take the steps through the approvals process? Also having a resource person available to help navigate these processes. This could be either on the municipality side or the matchmaking organization side. Now, we do have a specific zoning restrictions list and bylaw list that local governments can review of things they can do to make it easier and more enticing to make a secondary suite or coach house. I'm not going to go through those today, but we will be posting those on our archive site. At a high level, it includes things like parking minimums, where some municipalities have a bylaw where if you're creating a secondary suite, you need to include extra parking along with your 2 spaces for your single detached home. You need to create additional spaces with a secondary suite, and that can get very challenging and make a project untenable, perhaps. And there's also some building design requirements that can be really challenging for people trying to implement a coach house on a really specific lot size, for example. So now that we've kind of talked a little bit about the context, the challenges, what people have heard, what might an actual matchmaking program look like from a service provider's standpoint? So I'm going to include the building blocks here at a very high level. Hollyburn is working on their own pilot design and it might look a little bit different than this, but these are pieces that are important to consider if an organization was going to take this on and create a new program or streamline pieces of this into existing programming that they have. So at a high level, you gotta finalize policies, procedures, hire staff, recruit participants, and decide which communities you want to target, complete intake assessments. And this is one of the key pieces that we've heard, really getting a sense of what needs do the participants have, doing a home visit to check the site, and figuring out if any of the participants, either the home seeker or the home provider, have any hard restrictions like, oh, I'm allergic to pets, or I absolutely don't want smoking on my property, or things like that. And also completing some vetting, so background checks on both sides for all participants in this program. We also heard a lot about potential for learning opportunities. So if I'm becoming a landlord, what are my rights and responsibilities? If I'm a tenant or a home seeker, what are my responsibilities on the end? What am I agreeing to? Is there a potential to share conflict resolution tools? We know conflicts come up with sharing space a lot. So how can we be preemptive and offer some discussion tools or formats for conversations or check-ins that could help increase communication and avoid a big blow up over small matters? Once that piece is done, the home provider will need to set up the space. As you saw before, it might be as quick as a couple days for home sharing, or it might be a really long time if someone's building a coach house. And then we start to look into the matchmaking agreement. So this would be signed, and ideally there's multiple meetings between the home seeker and home provider. And the rent amount would be negotiated then. That can be part of the intake assessment. What can the home seeker afford? What does the home provider actually need? And you can add a layer of the matchmaking in that sense. And if someone has a financial support, are there any requirements about setting a certain amount of rent or the highest amount of rent set there? That can be a part of the conversation as part of the matchmaking agreement, along with setting the terms of the length of the tenancy and things like that. So once the matches are there, the organization can provide ongoing support as required if there's any referrals, and having optional check-ins. So figuring out at what period makes sense. Do you want to check in every 2 months, or what makes sense for the matchmake? And that can be a conversation that's happening during the agreement of saying, okay, we'll have a check-in every 2 months or every 3 months or one at first, and we'll decide from there. As people leave the program, then you can have some evaluation and iteration to say, okay, this worked really well. We need to tweak some of these policy and procedures and all that piece. So you might be thinking that there's a lot of steps actually before the matchmaking. So why did we include those? And we really wanted to focus on allowing, trying to work on preemptive work to make sure that we can help support conflicts that might potentially come up. Offering learning opportunities, maybe there's some cultural safety pieces there included, and hopefully it can mitigate potential conflicts down the road. And having a lot of communication beforehand and being really explicit about what are the needs and expectations of both parties, that can help make a smoother match, ideally. And I'll also note that some of our participants in our engagement sessions were really interested in a cohort model. So having a space to chat with people who are going through the program at the same time, or even just a community night where, a barbecue or picnic where all program participants can meet and connect if they're interested in that, to help build a sense of community. So with these building blocks, what are some things that an organization would need to think about before running a program like this? First, it's a question of how can you incorporate culturally appropriate support into this? Is it a learning opportunity? Are there ways you can embed that within the program? Deciding as an organization what level of conflict support is available. Some organizations might have social workers available to help with this, or some might say, we'll help with easy pieces and then we'll leave it at that point. Or we'll pass it on and escalate it to someone else to help resolve from there. Another big question is, should any of the work be outsourced? For example, there are companies who do this home sharing matchmaking, like Happy Pat or Sparrow, and there are existing trainings for people who are running home sharing, for example, like through Community Living BC has a set training through the Justice Institute of BC. The organization also should do some reflection to decide what are the boundaries of the support provided, how many referrals, what are topics that will be referred, and thinking about what supports you want to offer beyond matchmaking, if any. And we know that housing intersects with a lot of other needs of people, so things can get very complex. And finally, what are the criteria used to match participants? Are there specific communities that you're hoping to support through a program like this? And as you can see from this quote down here, there's a lot of folks who are feeling, the older adults especially, who are feeling the stress of this and saying, I don't have any options. No, it's all on me. No one can advise me. So having that extra support was really appealing to program participants, and having someone to talk through their options with was very appealing. And I'll pass it over to Leanne to talk us a little bit about a broader enabling context as well.
So we've been talking really specifically about, what does this program look like in all the program design. And one of the other pieces we also wanted to discuss was just thinking about how we're creating an enabling environment for these solutions at a neighborhood or a community level. During the Solutions Lab engagements, we heard anecdotal accounts of neighbors that were feeling harassed as homeowners because they had created a secondary suite, and neighbors were asking them about their concerns around parking, asking really specific questions about who is moving in. And so we are thinking about where is the opportunity for neighborhood level education or connection that might be an important component of supporting a successful program and sort of shifting the culture about what home sharing or having other housing arrangements can look like. It's also important to have advocates and community champions who share their positive experiences of home sharing within their social circles or with local governments or community members. And it's really about normalizing this form of housing and talking about the positive benefits for communities and for neighborhoods, as well as for individuals. Another piece of the broader context is this changing legislative landscape that we're in. The BC government has recently passed new housing legislation that is going to remove barriers for small-scale, multi-unit homes on single-family zoned land. And it will also help with expediting approval process for developments. And a few of these actually intersect with and interact with solutions that are explored by the lab. So for example, across BC, in most areas within municipalities of more than 5,000 people, these changes are requiring bylaws to allow for 3 or 4 units to be on lots that are currently single family or duplex use. So depending on the lot size, it could also go up to 6 units in transit-oriented areas. So this means that you can have options like adding laneway houses as of right. Another piece of legislation is allowing all communities to have a minimum of 1 secondary suite or 1 laneway home in all single family or duplex residential zones. So the landscape's changing a little bit here. There's also a new standardized housing design project. This is where the province is creating new standardized, customizable residential designs for small-scale multi-unit housing that's built on single lots. So this is, again, about coach houses or laneway homes. So where you have standardized designs, you could potentially have more economical options for constructing a laneway home. Overall, things could be looking a little bit different in BC in the coming years, and obviously the uptake remains to be seen. Rebecca, do you want to talk about supports for this program?
Yeah, so there are some existing supports that exist for housing solutions like these. So as of this month, there's a couple of funding opportunities I wanted to flag. First, the BC government has announced their secondary suite incentive program. And so this is starting April 1st. I believe it's a pilot of about 3,000 homes, and it's a deferrable loan if that secondary suite is rented below market rate for 5 years. Applications open April 1st, and there are specific details if you Google that program. It also includes a really comprehensive guide on how to create a secondary suite and questions you should be asking for your municipality or local government, and that guide is called Home Sweet Home. There's also, from the federal level, there's a multi-generational home renovation tax credit, and that's a portion of, I think it's a percentage of the amount spent on renovations, as long as there is an older family member going to live either in the primary house or in the secondary unit. And finally, also wanted to highlight that there's an opportunity to think environmental when we're doing renovations or building new designs. And there are some grants or rebates available through Clean BC Better Homes and Home Renovations Rebate Program. And retrofits here can improve the energy efficiency of the house, which can lower utility bills and allow for a more comfortable living environment, and especially in extreme weather conditions. And so you would take a look at funding through Clean BC there, or some financial institutions specifically have loan programs if you're doing energy efficient renovations as well. So where could this program go? Now, we know that this isn't a solution for everyone, but we know that a matchmaking program can really support the people who are looking for this type of solution and are excited about inviting this into their lives. And so right now it pairs well with a couple or solo older adult homeowners, and they're not the only ones who could benefit. So you could imagine a matchmaking program for home sharing that could match with any of the following groups in a community. It could match first responders who live outside of the community that they're serving, who need a place to stay a couple times a week consistently. You could look at housing teachers, nurses, firefighters, other public service workers. As well for folks who are already connected with immigrant support organizations, newcomers could really benefit from a home share program. And a program could really target a specific community for its first iterations before expanding to a more general audience. As Leanne was mentioning, it's really important to get the good stories out there and have the pilot program to say that this is a promising model and we have the experience of the first time to really build traction and momentum for something like this. And now, while these programs might not see a massive creation of new households, with the right supports, dozens of units could become available much faster than building a 20 unit under market rental building. And so I'll pass it back to Leanne to close this piece.
Yeah, so as we're wrapping up, we are imagining our connected communities of the future, and we're thinking about how housing is always personal. A lot of the participants in the lab were keenly interested in these solutions. And for those folks who are interested in these types of solutions, we're looking at ways to make it easier for people to say yes and to be able to uptake these types of options. For many older adults that we spoke with are seeking to have connected communities where they can age and maintain their networks. They want to see multi-generational communities where they can easily access transit and feel connected to their neighbors. These housing solutions can allow older adults to age in place longer and to provide much needed additional housing units to the housing market. Having an organization to coordinate matchmaking addressed many of the concerns that the older adults held about opening their homes. And so while these solutions may not be a silver bullet for the housing crisis, they are some opportunities to address aspects of the poly crisis that we're facing, including affordability, our aging population, climate change, and the housing crisis. So that's it for our presentation, and we wanted to open it up for questions. I've seen lots of interesting chat happening in the chat. I see one question so far in the Q&A, but I wanted to take a minute and just see if others have some questions that they want to add either in the chat or the Q&A. There's a couple of questions that came up, and one of them I see is Bruce Foster is asking about have tiny homes and tiny home communities been explored, and just reflecting that it's growing successfully in the US for less costly independent housing. Rebecca, do you want to respond to that one?
Yeah, so we didn't look at tiny homes in this specific iteration of the project, and it could be a possibility. We're not saying that this is the only model that could exist. I think tiny homes gets into a little bit of policy difficulties sometimes, depending on the municipality bylaws of requiring a minimum size of space for folks, but there is possibility there as well.
Thanks, Rebecca. I see a question about underutilized public land, and we'll actually have a quick comment about that a bit later. Underutilized public land was out of scope of this Housing Solutions Lab. We are really looking at housing that is owned by older adults and single detached homes, maybe duplexes, but kind of in that context and just keeping the scope quite narrow, knowing that we're working towards a pilot that will be small scale and hoping from there with keeping an eye to scalability. So certainly underutilized public land is another area of interest to Renewable Cities, and we can give a quick promotion about another one of our program workshops coming up that is working on that at the end here. What other questions do we have?
I'm seeing a lot of questions around like, how would this be funded? And so I'm gonna lump a lot of those together, and that's a great question. Hollyburn is currently pursuing funding for it, and there's not a really specific bucket or a grant to apply for funding for this. I think there's some organizations who are considering adding it into existing programming or other grants that they are applying for, but that is one of the big pieces right now is like, okay, we know it's going to take a lot of staff time to do this matchmaking, so how is this actually going to be funded? So unfortunately don't have specific answers, and maybe there's ways of integrating this into existing programming and existing or funding proposals that you're putting forward in your own work. And if anyone's has ideas of where funding could be looked for or received, feel free to add that to the chat.
Thanks, Rebecca. There's a couple of comments about, you know, other precedents or other examples where home sharing is happening. And certainly we're being very cognizant to not be trying to remake the wheel here. We know that there are a lot of existing examples, and so we spent a lot of time discussing and working with some of those groups and talking to them about some of the models of things that are working and challenges. And so, you know, so certainly with the home sharing with students was absolutely one of the models that we were looking at. So yeah, there are a number of examples. It's not you know, it's not a totally unprecedented idea. It's just sort of thinking about how do we potentially scale this or apply it in a way that apply it and start a program that is potentially scalable to different contexts beyond just students.
I see some follow-up questions about costs to users. It depends on the model. Again, I know there are some home sharing programs that charge $50 or so for the matchmaking fee, and then the rest as like an initial charge once a match is made for that one-time fee. And the model could look different depending on the situation and the organization. I believe Hollyburn is looking at getting separate funding, so there's not as much cost to the user.
There's a question from someone about the examples of the matchmaking process and knowing that it will be different. I wonder, Rebecca, if you could share a little bit of some of the context you had talked about, like Happy Pad, or just a little bit of some of their process or some other examples of how, you know, different ways that groups are doing matchmaking.
Yeah, I believe Happy Pad is an example, and this is not an advertisement for all of the different companies that exist out there or examples out there. They give a homeowner a view of like 7 potential renters to choose and match with. I don't think they do as much meeting and having those initial intake pieces, so it's not as focused around the needs. If you're doing more of a really needs-focused assessment-based model, it would take more time. And I also will mention that sometimes the scale doesn't need to be huge. You know, I think you don't need to have 50 matches at once. You can start small with a smaller number, like less than a dozen, and build up from there as well. And I'm thinking, or one participant was like, oh, it could be like a speed dating event, you know, having different options and that might not work as well on the organization side. But a lot of the models we've seen have either been, you know, extensive interviewing and more hands-on, or there's the more streamlined version that puts the power in the home providers, in the home provider's shoes of saying, okay, here are some options. Who are you most interested in matching with based on this information?
There's another question about someone's asking about a specific idea of using shipping containers to build a secondary home, and another person sort of commenting about, you know, that they've seen portables, you know, in schools, and sort of likening are those types of options possibilities as well. We did not look at those specific like building forms and sort of look at all of the specific ways that coach houses or laneway houses could be built, because there are some groups, another organization is called Small Housing BC, that are really specifically focused on the coach house option, for example. And because of the really high cost for construction, then we decided to focus more on the lower cost ones and the shorter timelines, such as secondary suites or home sharing for this lab. But we do point to a number of resources that could be looking at what are some options available. One thing I will note is that certainly prefabricated buildings, and I'm not necessarily just talking about, you know, what we think of as like mobile homes or trailers, but actually prefabricated buildings that are like, you almost can think of it as like it's offsite construction that you can bring in almost like little Lego blocks that you actually put together on site, that can be other ways of building homes, and that could be more economical and also more come in really at the top of the step code in terms of efficiency with the building itself. So those are also certainly great options, and something we've been looking at is prefabricated mass timber, but also with the multi-unit housing as well. So that's another program area, but not on the laneway houses specifically. That hasn't been a focus for us. There is a question about slides and the presentation. So yes, the slides are going to be shared. The presentation that United Way will be posting it. So those will be available for you.
And I see a question asking about further opportunities. Our Housing Solutions Lab is ending at the end of March, and then it'll be on Hollyburn to start to actually work out the details of this. But if you're interested in some of the other initiatives Renewable Cities is involved in, we put out calls for support on our newsletter. And so I'll show that slide in a moment for folks who are interested.
Yeah, so I think just looking at the time, we'll plan to wrap up here. Oh, I see Laura.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for those wonderful presentations today, and also for all the great questions in the chat. I know that you had a couple of announcements that you wanted to do, just telling about some upcoming work. So I'll hand it back to you, and then we can wrap up the webinar.
Thanks. So Rebecca's sharing a slide here. I alluded to this a little earlier. So before we go, we have one project that we're working on. We've just released 7 case studies. This is outside of the seniors or older adults focused housing specifically, but we're looking at 7 case studies of non-traditional developers. So this is where we're talking about underutilized land, where nonprofits and public groups have created housing on the land that they own or land that was donated. So there's a link there that you can use. We're hosting a workshop in May for nonprofits that may be interested in creating housing on their own land. And so if you're interested in this, if you're a nonprofit that owns land that it might be interested in redeveloping their land, send us a message, or you can sign up for updates or for more information. So that's information is there. Thanks so much to the United Way team, Laura, Ravi, and Olivia. Thanks for the United Way BC Seniors Housing Working Group for sponsoring this session. And Rebecca is happy to follow up with anyone if you have any other questions. So thanks so much.
Oh, great. Thank you very much as well. We really enjoyed that presentation, and I've learned so much today, and it's really exciting to hear about all the possibilities. As I mentioned, we'll be sending out the webinar recording, and we can also send out the PowerPoint slides and that information about the workshop, as well as Rebecca's contact information if you want to follow up with any additional questions, as I know there was lots of thoughts and ideas in the chat. So if you missed your chance to ask a question, you'll be able to follow up, and hopefully we'll see a great turnout at the workshop as well, because I think that's a very interesting idea, using those nonprofit or underused public lands. So thank you so much for joining us today, and we hope that you continue to tune in to the work that SFU Renewable Cities is doing, and then also the Housing Working Group and United Way BC to address this housing affordability crisis. All right, thank you everyone, and take care.
Thank you.